Adele said Frank changed her life. Lady Gaga said it gave her hope. The world called it a masterpiece. The only person who refused to listen to it was the woman who made it. And the reason has nothing to do with the music. But to understand why Amy Winehouse could not bring herself to listen to her own debut album, you need to understand something about the way she related to her own songs. Because for Amy, a recording was never a product. It was never a piece of content to be marketed and streamed and discussed in the abstract. A song was an occasion. It was a specific moment in her life, preserved in amber, unchangeable and permanent. When she recorded something, she was not documenting a feeling. She was sealing it, locking it into a form that would exist long after the feeling itself had moved on or transformed or been replaced by something she had not yet experienced. That was the gift and the cost of what she did. The honesty that made her music extraordinary was the same honesty that made it impossible to revisit. She said it directly in one of those interviews where she was asked a question and gave an answer so precise and unexpected that the journalist who received it must have sat there for a moment, not quite knowing what to write next. "A song marks an occasion in my life," she said, "and that's how I live my life, by songs. I know definitive points in my life and in relationships because of my songs." This is the thing that separated Amy Winehouse from almost every other artist of her generation. She was not writing songs about feelings. She was writing songs that were the feeling, at the exact moment it existed, with no distance between the experience and the record. Back to Black had been made this way. Frank had been made this way. Every song she ever recorded was made this way. The honesty was not a stylistic choice, it was a constitutional fact about who she was. Which meant that listening to Frank was not, for Amy, the experience of hearing a good album she had made when she was young. It was the experience of returning to specific rooms in her life that she had left and locked behind her. Every track was a moment. Every lyric was something she had felt at a precise point in time that had since passed, that she had moved through and beyond, that she was no longer the person who had felt. To hear it was to be pulled back into those moments with a force that most people who make music never have to contend with, because most people who make music maintain some distance between themselves and the material. Amy maintained none. She was 19 years old when she recorded Frank. She had bought her first guitar at 15, had started writing music at 16, had been performing in jazz clubs around North London since she was still a teenager. She had signed to Island Records at 19 on the basis of a single audition that had stopped a room. She had gone to Miami with Salaam Remi and spent weeks recording in the intimate, collaborative way that their sessions always had. She had poured into those songs the accumulated emotional material of her late teens, the relationships, the observations, the self-awareness that struck people who met her as remarkable for someone her age. She had written about love and sex and the men who had failed to meet what she needed from them, and the ways she had failed herself, and the sharp, funny, sometimes brutal honesty with which she saw the world. There was something specific about the making of Frank that had gone wrong in ways Amy could identify clearly but could not fix after the fact. She had come to the project with a vision that was precise, a jazz-inflected record that moved between the classic American songbook she had grown up inside and the contemporary neo-soul and R&B that she was listening to in the early 2000s. Salaam Remi had understood that vision. The Miami sessions had been exactly what she wanted, intimate, collaborative, with Amy singing and playing guitar and Remi building the arrangements around her rather than asking her to fit inside arrangements that had been built without her.
But Frank had 5 producers. In addition to Remi, there were Commissioner Gordon, Jimmy Hogarth, Matt Rowe, and Amy herself. 5 different sensibilities, 5 different approaches, 5 sets of ideas about what the album should sound like, none of which were entirely wrong, but none of which were entirely aligned with each other. The result was a record that contained some of the most extraordinary moments of Amy's career, alongside tracks that felt like compromises, like the version of her that the industry was willing to accommodate, rather than the version she was trying to be. And then she had handed it to Island Records, and the people at Island had done what record companies do. They had made decisions about marketing and promotion and sequencing and presentation that Amy had no control over and did not agree with. 5 producers took credits on the album alongside her. The promotional campaign was, in Amy's own assessment, a shambles. The marketing was fucked. The people making those decisions were idiots. Nice idiots, she was careful to specify. Idiots who knew they were idiots, so you could not really be angry at them in the straightforward way. But idiots nonetheless, in charge of something she had made that she felt she had lost control of in the making, and lost again in the presenting. Frank charted at number 60 in the UK on release. Not a disaster, but considerably below what had been expected for an artist who had stopped rooms and won over producers and generated the kind of industry excitement that preceded her signing. Over the following months, it climbed gradually to number 13 by January 2004, a position it reached slowly and almost accidentally through word of mouth and critical attention rather than through any promotional push. It won an Ivor Novello Award. It was shortlisted for the Mercury Prize. It introduced Amy Winehouse's voice to everyone who was paying attention. The slow climb of Frank up the UK chart from 60 to 13 over 4 months was the kind of success that the music industry tended to undervalue precisely because it was organic. It had not been manufactured by a promotional campaign or driven by radio airplay or accelerated by the kind of marketing spend that turned albums into events. It had happened because people heard it, told other people, and those people bought it and told more people. It was the sound of genuine enthusiasm moving through a population that had not been told to be enthusiastic. It was the best possible evidence that the music worked, that what Amy had made was real in a way that did not require external validation or industry support to communicate itself. The slow climb of Frank up the UK chart from 60 to 13 over 4 months was the kind of success that the music industry tended to undervalue precisely because it was organic. It had not been manufactured by a promotional campaign or driven by radio airplay or accelerated by the kind of marketing spend that turned albums into events. It had happened because people heard it, told other people, and those people bought it and told more people. It was the sound of genuine enthusiasm moving through a population that had not been told to be enthusiastic. It was the best possible evidence that the music worked, that what Amy had made was real in a way that did not require external validation or industry support to communicate itself. The Mercury Prize shortlisting and the Ivor Novello Award that followed confirmed what the word of mouth had already established. Frank was not a failed debut that had been rescued by critical attention. It was a record that had found its audience through the channels that matter most, directly, person to person, on the basis of what it sounded like rather than what it was being marketed as. Amy was not paying attention, not to the album as a commercial object, not to the reviews, not to the gradual accumulation of an audience that would eventually grow into something no one had anticipated. She had made the record and given it to the world, and the world had done what it was going to do with it. What she could not do was live inside it the way the world was now asking her to.
She told The Guardian that some things on the album made her go to a little place that was fucking bitter. She said she had never heard it from start to finish. She said she did not have it in her house. She said she wanted to go to everyone's house and take it back. Not to destroy it, but to work on it for 5 more years until it was perfect, and then give it back. She said her album was not shit. She said if she heard someone else singing like her on it, she would buy it in a heartbeat. That last sentence is perhaps the most honest thing she ever said about Frank, which is saying something, because the album itself is one of the most honest records of the decade. She could hear the talent. She could hear the voice. She could hear the person she had been at 19 before the world had shown her everything it was going to show her. What she could not do was separate the hearing from the feeling, the specific, visceral, involuntary return to the occasions those songs marked, to the rooms she had locked and moved away from. The world that had fallen in love with Frank could hear it differently.
Adele, who was 15 when it was released, said it changed her life. The permission to be direct, to make music from the real substance of your experience rather than from a safe distance. Lady Gaga said it gave her hope. Sam Smith cited it as formative. A generation of British artists who came after Amy had found, in Frank, a demonstration of something they had needed to see. The irony was not lost on anyone who knew Amy. The album she had struggled to give to the world, the one she refused to keep in her house, the one she could not listen to, had quietly become one of the most influential debut records in British music history. The thing she could not look at had become a mirror that everyone else was using to find themselves in. Between Frank and Back to Black, Amy did not write for 18 months. She said this directly, that after Frank she had gone through a period in which nothing came. This is understandable in the context of everything else that was happening in those months. The album she had made had been taken out of her hands and given to a world that received it on terms she had not controlled. The experience of making it had been not what she wanted it to be. The experience of releasing it had been worse. And the songs themselves, those locked rooms, those sealed occasions, were now property of everyone who had bought the record, to be listened to and discussed and analyzed by people who had no idea what it had cost to make them. It was only when she met Blake Fielder Civil in 2005 and experienced the specific grief of his departure that the writing came back. And when it came back, it came with a different quality. Not the ambitious, exploratory quality of Frank, the young woman trying out voices and styles and finding her way toward something. It came with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she was trying to say and had the technique now to say it with complete precision. Back to Black was what happened when Amy Winehouse knew who she was and what she had to say and had found the producer and the musicians who could build the right architecture around her voice. Frank was what happened first, before the certainty, before the technique fully caught up with the instinct, before the beehive and the tattoos and the 5 Grammys and the 30 million records. When she was still 19 and figuring things out and sealing those occasions into songs without knowing yet that she would never be able to hear them again without going back inside the rooms she had left.
What the world heard when it listened to Frank was a young woman who was more self-aware than almost anyone her age, who could write a song that was simultaneously funny and devastating, who had a voice that belonged to a different era but was entirely of the present. What Amy heard was something different, something more specific. She heard 19-year-old Amy, the girl from Southgate who had not yet met Blake Fielder Civil, who had not yet made Back to Black, who had not yet been photographed in various states of crisis by people she had not consented to be photographed by. She heard the before, and the before was a place she could not visit without feeling everything that had happened after. She said once, and this is the sentence that clarifies everything about why Frank was impossible for her, that she knew definitive points in her life and in relationships because of her songs. The songs were not representations of those moments. They were the moments. They had the same reality as the moment they documented, preserved in a form that could be replayed indefinitely. What the world heard when it listened to Frank was a young woman who was more self-aware than almost anyone her age, who could write a song that was simultaneously funny and devastating, who had a voice that belonged to a different era but was entirely of the present. What Amy heard was something different, something more specific. She heard 19-year-old Amy, the girl from Southgate who had not yet met Blake Fielder Civil, who had not yet made Back to Black, who had not yet been photographed in various states of crisis by people she had not consented to be photographed by. She heard the before, and the before was a place she could not visit without feeling everything that had happened after. She said once, and this is the sentence that clarifies everything about why Frank was impossible for her, that she knew definitive points in her life and in relationships because of her songs. The songs were not representations of those moments. They were the moments. They had the same reality as the moment they documented, preserved in a form that could be replayed indefinitely. That is the gift that made Back to Black what it was. It is also the cost that made Frank unlistenable to the person who made it.
There is a moment in Asif Kapadia's documentary Amy where footage of the young Amy, 9, 10, 11 years old, before any of it had happened, is placed alongside the recordings she would make years later. The girl in the footage is completely herself, completely present, unguarded in the way the children are unguarded when they are not yet aware of being watched. And watching it, you understand something about what Frank was for Amy that you could not have understood from the album alone. In 2015, when Asif Kapadia's documentary brought Frank back into public conversation, the album was reissued on vinyl and reintroduced to a generation that had come to Amy through Back to Black. It entered the charts again. It reached number 33. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies to people who had not heard it before. People who were discovering Amy's voice through the prism of the tragedy that had ended her story, and were going back to the beginning to find where it had started. They found an album made by a 19-year-old girl from Southgate who had walked into Island Records, sat down in a chair, and sung one song. They found in that album the before, the version of Amy that existed before everything the years had added to her, before the tabloids and the crisis and the 5 Grammys won from a satellite studio at 2 in the morning. She had given the world the most honest account she could of who she was at 19, and the world had received it and called it a masterpiece and played it on repeat and cited it as a life-changing record. And Amy had moved on, as people move on, into the years that followed, the years that contained Blake and Back to Black, and the Grammys and the tabloids and the hospital admissions and the 3 weeks of abstinence and the final July morning in Camden. Frank was still there when she was gone, still in everyone's houses except hers, still the record she wanted to take back and work on for 5 more years until it was perfect and then give back. She never got the 5 years, but the album was already perfect. It always had been. She just could not hear it that way, because she was the only person for whom it was not music. It was memory.